tonight's program, Linden Hills History 101. Enjoy an abbreviated version of Linden Hills' rich history, early Native American villages, Lake Harriet pavilions, streetcars, a vibrant business district, and interesting people whose efforts built this special place. We have two presenters tonight, as you can see, Peter Sussman and Aaron Isaacs. Peter Sussman, far in the blue shirt, local historian, architect, board member of Preserve Minneapolis, has had a significant role in the preservation and interpretation of Minneapolis history, and specifically southwest and north side of Minneapolis. Most notable community representation has included on the Lake Harriet Bandshell Advisory Committee, on the cultural recognition and public artwork at Bede-Makaska. He has presented many programs for the Linden Hills History Study Group over the years, including on local women leaders, organizations, history of neighborhood houses, buildings, their occupants, and businesses. He is known for thorough research, careful deliberation and interpretation, openness to listen and share with others. Aaron Isaac, closer to me, is a 40-plus year volunteer for the Minnesota Streetcar Museum. Incidentally, Peter's a volunteer for the museum, too, where he serves as a historian, board chair, and motorman. He is also noted a local history author. His works include Twin City by Trolley, the streetcar era in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Twin Ports by Trolley, the streetcar area in Duluth Superior, Como Harriet streetcar line, the 1940s, Interurban Special Number 14. And he is a longtime editor of the Minnesota Streetcar Museum's magazine, Twin City Lines, formerly the Minne-Gazette. He has presented many very popular programs to the Linden Hills History Study Group over the years. In the recent 5 years, his programs included Minneapolis Reuses the Railroad, Trench Warfare in Midtown Minneapolis from Railroad to Greenway, a preservation on Southwest Streetcar, and he has been showing us the communities along the streetcar lines for Bryant and Nicollet Avenue and now Lake Street. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, to start, when we had the planning session for the programs this year, we said, boy, it's been a long time since we just talked about Linden Hills. I bet we have a whole new group of people who have not heard that story. And so we decided to do Linden Hills 101. This title picture is about 1954. I'm sure you know where that is. And now I'm going to turn it over to Peter to get started. You don't? Okay, that is right in the middle of the block between 43rd and 44th Street. And the building to the right is just right next door to Sebastian Joe's. The building to the left that says the Upton is the toy store.
Okay, yeah. So Aaron and I each have chosen slides of subjects that we're most familiar with. As you might guess, Aaron's going to cover a lot of the story of the streetcar system, which is integral to the neighborhood's history. I'm going to cover the early years, and then we're going to mix it up a little bit along the way. So I have to assume that this is new to at least some of you. So we're starting with the existence of Fort Snelling and the community that was established on the shores of Bede-Makaska in 1829, which was Cloudman's Village. And the Indian agent, Lawrence Tolliver, drew this map. These are the significant locations at the time: Fort Snelling, where his agency was, and then up the Mississippi to the Falls of St. Anthony, up the Minnesota, and then the lakes that we know, including the Dakota Village that was established on the east side of Lake Calhoun, and the Mission School, which is on the west side of Lake Harriet. If you go down to the east side of Bede-Makaska, now opposite Lakewood Cemetery, opposite the end point of the Como Harriet streetcar line, you'll see public artwork, and we'll get back to that a little bit later. But these are some new signs that have just gone up, interpretive signs at the exhibit, and it shows the location of Cloudman's Village, Heata Otunwa, and some of the drawings that were shown representing the Dakota life in the village and in the surroundings for those 10 years that the village existed. Now, I've done some similar programs, and you can look online. Both Aaron and I have programs that are a part of the series that David mentioned. But I make the distinction while recognizing and honoring the Dakota past. There's a transformation, a radical transformation, and that is the U.S. government sends a team of surveyors, and they survey the property in the area. So it's gone from a communal collective ownership or presence to actual physical ownership of property and as a commodity. So this is the barely changed natural setting around Lake Harriet in this instance. And let's move on. So within a few years of that 1854 survey, the initial land holdings, which could go up to 160 acres, you've heard of the grant program where for $1 an acre you could, the Homestead Act, up to 160 acres. $1 was worth more then, but still pretty reasonable. And these initial claimants, in this case around the lakes, were bought out by a few large property owners. They established some very large farms. And so what we know as the community, especially around Lake Harriet, was divided into 3 large farms. To the east, the largest area held by William King was about 1,600 acres. If you know of Lakewood Cemetery, Lakewood is 250 acres of Lindell Farm. So 250 out of 1,700 acres, you can start to imagine how large that farm was. King's Highway on the east, thank you, Aaron, was donated by William King to the park board. So it's not a royal highway, it was the King family, okay? And so on the right is King's Lindell Farm, and those barns are now the park board's maintenance division along King's Highway. So to the west, beyond or west of Beard Avenue, was Jonathan Grimes' Lake Calhoun Nursery. He owned about 640 acres, and that extended out to Edina Mills, out past Wooddale to the west into what's now Edina, and as far south as 50th Street. Yeah, if you start to go across France Avenue, you'll not only see his new house pictured here on the left, built in the 1860s, but his family got to name a lot of the streets in the neighborhood, Grimes, his son Alden, etc. To the southwest was a relatively modest landholder, Charles McGreeve, had 250 acres on the southwest shore of Lake Harriet, and he named that the Sunnyside Farm. So if any of you are familiar with the road that diverges from 44th Street, going a little bit diagonally southwest, that Sunnyside Road was named after Jonathan Grimes' friend, Charles Reeve, and his Sunnyside Farm. So the city is growing rapidly. You think about the people who envisioned what this metropolitan area could be with the tremendous natural resources. Okay. And at the time Lakewood Cemetery was established in 1872, there were only about 20,000 people in the entire area. Within 20, 30 years, a little bit more than that, they anticipated that the entire metropolitan area would approach 1 million people. And their faith in the future was justified. This was a tremendous economic and industrial center in this part of the country. And the lakes were incorporated by 1883 and 1887 in our neighborhood as part of that growth of the city. But it's one thing to divide the property and plat it in subdivisions. It's something else for those lots to actually be buildable. There's a term called submarine lots, which means basically if you don't go out and take a look at whether your lot is above water or below water, that last map there on the left side, you see the streets aren't in there to the southwest of what's identified as Lake Calhoun. That's because this is all marshy area, and we'll get to that a little bit later. There was a recreation era between the initial platting and the development of the community. This is the south shore of Bedema-Casca. There was a visitor in 1861 named Henry David Thoreau, and he stayed at the Hamilton House at the south shore of the lake. This is the house in the left-hand corner there, and the shoreline and a boating party. So the South Shore is named Cottage City in 1883, and these are some of the homes that were built in the immediate area, some very, very modest. There is Charles and Mattie Mousseau in the left-hand corner there. That's their little stockade cabin that they built up for $200. That was the last surviving cabin on the lake, and we'll show you a photograph later of what stands there now. A few other modest homes. There was no parkway. It just went down the hill to the lake. The May House was for travelers around to the lakes. They could get some provisions and have a meal there. And a significant family, the Linden family on the right-hand side there, they built their large house in 1890 on the site of what was the Hamilton House that Thoreau stayed at. So a part of the story is the transformation of the community, including the filling in of the lakes, especially what's now Bede-Bakaska, and a lot of that sort of lawn area around Thomas Beach and extending on the west shore especially. This was all part of the lake, and so they dredged what were the glacial deposits from the bottom of the lake and created these large lawn areas, and that was the second superintendent, Theodore Worth, who came here about 1906, and he was responsible for that improvement, they called it. Okay, we'll see what happened later on. I mentioned the Linden family and their home, the upper left-hand corner. The descendants of Andreas and Clara Linden, their children, took the house down in the 1950s and built some larger multifamily homes back of the lake with a underground common garage accessible from the parkway. So this is the aerial photograph of that site today. Okay, so the significant event really was the naming of Linden Hills. And that was announced in this newspaper in 1889. And the very significant person in this whole story is named Thomas Lowry. And he was a businessman, young man from Illinois, who became interested in real estate. And of course, to get people out to their holdings, you had to have a streetcar. You couldn't walk too far from town. So this is really this part of the story of Lowry. He becomes enamored of this area. He starts to build pavilions, which we'll see a little bit later on. But he accumulates the property on the west side of Lake Harriet. And in 1889, he names it Linden Hills on account of the linden trees that adorn the hills.
Oh, look, there's a train. I guess it's my turn. Okay, so once again, you had to get there, and it actually wasn't Lowry who created the first link. It was a fellow named Colonel McCrory. A lot of these people had Colonel in their name. I'm not sure if they actually were colonels. But he built the little, originally called the Lyndale Railway, then the Minneapolis-Lyndale and Lake Calhoun. And it's a little steam-powered railroad that started on Marquette Avenue in downtown, went out Nicollet Avenue to 31st Street, across 31st to just west of about Humboldt, and then cut across the country and ended on the east shore of Lake Calhoun. And what you see in the distance, and who built the pavilion again?
It was King.
King of Lyndale Farm built that pavilion. You know, if you were going to go out there, you had to have something to go to because there weren't any people yet. So anyway, this was before electric streetcars became possible, and so this was a little steam-powered railway. And it ran like every 45 minutes, and in 1879 it reached Lake Calhoun. In 1880, on the 4th of July, it was extended to Lake Harriet. And we found a newspaper story where the trains were greatly overloaded trying to get out there for the 4th of July, and there were so many people at the lake for the fireworks and all that they couldn't all get on the train to go back that night, so a lot of them camped out overnight and went back the next day. But anyway, Thomas Lowry and his associates took over this line in 1886 and made it part of the larger streetcar system. Now, one thing that was an unsuccessful experiment was the steamboat Hattie, which you see there in the right-hand picture, to take tours of the lake. And they ran it for a couple years. It was not a financial success, and so the last attempt to make money off it was that they burned it as a public spectacle, and sunk it on the lake. Oh, I'm sorry. I had one more. So anyway, do any of you know along 44th Street, there's a little one-block street called Motor Place. It goes from Beard to Chowan, and that is named for the motor line. The motor line, although it only went to Lake Harriet, started in 1880. From 1882 to 1886, they extended it out along 44th Street, out through Hopkins, all the way to Lake Minnetonka. And this was to cash in on the national tourist craze in Lake Minnetonka in the late 1880s, where 4 different railroads went out there. This line was the worst of the railroads. And so it only lasted 4 years. They cut it back to Lake Harriet. But by the time it was gone, they had named Motor Place, and also in Edina, just east of Brookside, is a little motor street named for it.
So this is part of the story of the Grimes family, because Jonathan Grimes' property east of what's now Beard Avenue became the logical route for this track to run out to Lake Minnetonka. And he was a visionary. Grimes was a horticulturalist, very well regarded, and he saw an opportunity to build a model community. This was going to be called Waveland. Now, as familiar as you are with Linden Hills, you may only know that name because there's a little triangular park just north of 44th Street called Waveland Park. But 1882 was the first effort. Nothing much happening at that point, although he was approached by a seminary that if he would donate 10 acres, they would establish a seminary in Waveland. It turned out that it was not really on the up and up. They were just trying to get some free land, but there is no seminary in Linden Hills. Okay, so 3 years later, in 1885, he's got a little bit more realistic view of what's going to happen, and he replats that area. And you may recognize these streets. There's this area north of 44th between Beard and Drew, basically. Yeah, okay. Drew, Ewing, those are those curvilinear streets that sort of followed that fashion like you have in Tangletown, where you're working with the topography. And that's unique to Linden Hills. So the street pattern stayed. And the only surviving house from that era was the one here next to the map at the bottom. That was George Grimes's house. He was one of the sons of Jonathan Grimes, and just a few years ago it was torn down. I think that the city did not appreciate that historic connection. At any rate, there's a large apartment block there, and that's part of the story along the way. So here we are at Lake Harriet, because with the arrival of the motor line in 1880, Lake Harriet is transformed. It's now accessible. You didn't need your horse and carriage. You could take the motor line out, and there were refreshments down there, maybe not so much else to draw people, but there was a tourist hotel that Louis Menage, an early developer, built called the Bellevue House.
And this was before the park board, right?
Oh, this was, well, it was actually more or less coincident with the park board, because the park board is established in 1883. They don't acquire the land around Lake Harriet till 1885, and the hotel is 1884. But there wasn't, you could draw things on paper. There wasn't a whole lot out there besides a dirt path around the lake. So eventually the clubhouse becomes a clubhouse, which is operated by the Lurline Club, a social and boating club over at then Lake Calhoun by Lake Street, and they have their summer social headquarters overlooking Lake Harriet. This is based on a map that I drew for the park board when they were dedicating what I still think is the new band shell back in 1986. And I took a lot of the maps that were available and I overlaid these structures. So there have been 5 music facilities, and the earliest was the largest, actually, right along what was then the motor line tracks, or I guess just beyond when Lowry had acquired them, but still it was the steam line, and that pavilion was about 400 feet long. This was going to be large enough to play a baseball game under the roof. So there was a theater for concerts and a large 500-seat restaurant at the tracks. That burned down in 1891. The streetcar company knew what they wanted. The attraction was at the lake. The next pavilion was built along the lake shore, and it's really beautiful. And we got some photographs. The next, 1904. So these are the earliest images. Upper left-hand corner, when the motor line came out, there was a concessionaire named Palmer, and he had his trade card, ran some boats off of the dock there. The 1888 pavilion, and then upper right, and actually the right-hand, both those images in the lower left are of the era of the pagoda-style pavilion, built in 1891, burned down in 1903. And before Aaron grabs the microphone, the street. Well, there is the merry-go-round. Yes, yeah. So this was the operator of the pavilion, and the merry-go-round didn't necessarily coordinate with the music performance. So the concerts were a little bit disturbed sometimes by the loud music from the carousel. What I was going to mention is another name comes in, which is one of the well-known and respected architects of the era, Harry Weil Jones. And he designed both the Pagoda Pavilion of 1891 and then the subsequent pavilion. This is not yet. This is still the Pagoda Pavilion. What you needed was, if you faced the lake, you had to have some place for the band to perform. So right beyond, you see this little shell that they would row out to project the music over the crowd in the pavilion and then park it back at the shore. Pavilion burns down in 1903. In 1904, this grand classical style pavilion with a roof deck. So if you wanted to hear music now, you had two arms stretching out from the band shell or the bandstand, and they could get about 2,500 people up there on the roof. Main level had a combination of a cafe and bathing. It was changing rooms because you could swim out the backside of the pavilion. This is a view from the band's seats up at the bandstand, looking along the west shore. And this has traditionally been, although I guess if you're looking down at the lake now, the boat rental is on the east side of the bandstand. Originally, it went up along the west side, and boating was so popular that the canoes and rowboats were stretching out to 44th Street. Yeah. Okay, also popular in our winter season were toboggan runs, and the park board would build these. This is up from near where the streetcar bridge is up at Queen and Linden Hills Boulevard, going down the high point. That's the Dakota Flats up there with the dual track toboggans running down the hill. And then I want to mention, I think Aaron's just about to take over, but this Beard's Plaisance. If you're familiar with this picnic shelter, who was Beard? It's a rhetorical question. Okay, so Henry Beard was a minister who went into real estate. And he happened to build on his early success by buying a large parcel of property, which comprises almost the entire neighborhood of Linden Hills, south of 40th Street, west to Beard Avenue, and down to 47th Street. That was all part of his grand vision. And he sold off property, and it was in the hands of several hundred people, a lot here, a lot there, until Lowry came and tried to consolidate it all when Lowry came into the picture. But Beard donated the 5-acre park on the west side of Lake Harriet, now known as Beard's Plaisance. And this is the shelter that was built by the park board, I think 1903, 1904, also designed by Harry Weil Jones.
Okay, I'm going to go over the streetcars. This is a map taken from a brochure. The Streetcar Company from 1907 to 1917 put out a big brochure every year on how to see the Twin Cities. And this particular map shows the streetcar lines as of about 1912. And so you had the Como-Harriet line coming out Hennepin Avenue to 31st Street, where it took over the right-of-way of the old motor line. And it went down there between the lakes and along 44th Street. In 1912, it spouted a branch that went down Xerxes Avenue to 50th, and then over 50th to end at 50th and Penn. That became known as the Oak Harriet line. and then it continued out west. Starting in 1905, the line was extended from Lake Harriet all the way to Lake Minnetonka. And so they went out along 44th Street, basically through Edina, along the south side of the Meadowbrook Golf Course and the north side of the Interlaken Golf Course. And by the way, Thomas Lowry and his brother-in-law Calvin Goodrich, who later took over the streetcar company, were founding members of Interlaken, and so they put a station there to serve it when Interlaken was built. And then it went right next to Blake School, on the south side of Blake School, through Hopkins. If you go on Excelsior Boulevard through Hopkins, that is the old streetcar right-of-way. And then split west of Hopkins with one line going to Deep Haven and the other going to Excelsior and then further to Tonka Bay. And then from Excelsior and Tonka Bay, you could catch streetcar company steamboats that went all over the lake. And so this was the era that this map is from. You'll also see a line on West Lake Street going around the north side of Lake Calhoun, and then the line on East Lake Street. So we're going to start on the east side of Lake Calhoun and simply take a trip through Linden Hills. And so, Peter, this was about when?
Well, the 1893 Lakewood Station is shown there, so I'm just going to date it about 1900.
Okay, and so this is crossing 36th Street. And you'll notice that there are two roadways. There's the Parkway along the scalloped hedges, which somebody was clearly trimming by hand. But next to it, in dirt, is you see Richfield Road. Now, Richfield Road is the road that we use today. Back in, I want to say, the 60s or the 70s, they decided that the Parkway was unnecessary, but they retained two segments of it for parking. And so the parking lot that's just south of 36th Street today is a piece of the old Parkway. And the peak roof building you see there is the station for Lakewood Cemetery. That's how you got there by transit, and that happens to be right where today our streetcars end. And the reason there's a gate in the fence is that that's where you used to get off the streetcar. And this is in front of that, very like 1892, 93. And here you see a pretty heavy crowd headed for Lake Harriet, and you're looking up the hill at a lot of the monuments within Lakewood Cemetery. And so you progress down, and this is what we today call William Berry Parkway. It was at the time called Interlaken Road, Interlaken meaning between Lakes Calhoun and Harriet. It has it's distinguished by being the first reinforced concrete arch bridge in Minnesota, for what that's worth. And when it was originally built, if you see these knee walls that are those concrete walls at the bottom of them, those didn't exist. The track was up at the level of the top of those. But then they had to figure out how to get a double-deck streetcar to Lake Minnetonka, as well as to ship out the steamboats that they built over at the streetcar barn at 31st and Nicollet. And they had to ship those through. And so they needed to lower the track under this bridge and under the Linden Hills Boulevard Bridge. And that's when those knee walls went in. And that's also where the stairway, which is still there today, they had to go and make a little right turn and add a little extra stairs. So you can see this when you ride our streetcar. And so here we are at 42nd Street. You're looking down at the last pavilion. To the left is another Harry Wild Jones building. It was a joint streetcar park board building. And so it was how people arrived at the park. But in addition, inside those arched windows, there was a dining area. There was kind of an ice cream parlor, confectionery on that floor. And then in the basement were storage rooms for the park board and a holding cell for the park police. And so you go a little further south, and this is the Linden Hills Boulevard Bridge. Today our streetcar barn is under that. And where we're standing, where the photographer is standing, is the public alley. The old right-of-way has been converted from that bridge over to Linden Hills as a public alleyway now. But that's why if you go and stand on the west end of that bridge, there's a stairway going down. Well, that stairway was to get to the streetcar stop that was here. And then just west of there, around the corner, where there are a bunch of apartments now, was the Lake Harriet Loop. And until 1905, this is where the streetcars ended and then were extended further out. But this is where they would turn cars around that they ran extra service for Lake Harriet. So if you had a concert or something, they'd go and stage streetcars here. The loop itself is now, and you'll see an aerial photo of it later. The loop itself now is the parking lots for a bunch of apartment buildings. Those houses and apartments that you see behind the streetcar are still there. And so now we're crossing 42nd Street. You can see the building on the left, which is today Great Harvest Bakery. The building on the right, which was Clark Hardware, then Byers Hardware, and is now the Martina Restaurant. And if you can see right behind the streetcar, there's kind of a big square brick building, and that's called the Lake Harriet Terminal House. And there are feeder lines that supplied the electricity, ran underground to this point into the terminal house, and then from there went to an above-ground pole line to go all the way out to Lake Minnetonka. And so this is Xerxes Avenue, the branch I told you about. When you got down to Xerxes, it split off and went down to 50th, and you're standing at 46th Street looking down the hill to 47th Street. And now we're back at Xerxes and 44th and looking west along the right-of-way. And today, it looks like this. The Linden Hills Neighborhood Council has turned 2 blocks of it into the trolley path. And you can go out there today and see it. And the building that you see, this is crossing Beard Avenue. The streetcar is coming out of what is today the Turtle Bread parking lot. And the Miller grocery store there, that's where Turtle Bread is today. And so here we are a little further out. This is at Chowan. Those buildings on the right that have the Sears coffee shop, the yardware store. I think there's an automotive repair place in there. But you can see the streetcar was what covered and that's Motor Place there to the left of the streetcar. And then there was a loop at 44th and France in what is now the parking lot for the liquor store. And you can see the building in far left, that's the old Oddfellows Hall, which is now retail. It's painted white now. And then there was a branch that went down France Avenue. So that was the streetcars. There was an idea that was proposed by the park board that never happened. If you know where Linden Hills Park is, and that's down where it says Lagoon, and if you go north of there, it was a wetland. That's you'll see that in Minneapolis a lot. Is that the ground is kind of lower? Well, they're old wetlands that they drained. And Linden Hills Park is one of them. And this was a proposal to go and run a channel down this really low-lying area down to Linden Hills Park, but it never happened. But Linden Hills Park did. I don't know which angle we're at right here. And now, of course, there's the park today with the modern park building.
So Linden Hills Boulevard was originally called Park Boulevard, platted in 1887, and this was, I think, the first street that actually had pavement in the neighborhood. The park board paved the street about 1912 when it was renamed Linden Hills Boulevard, and this is a photograph from the 1920s. Going back to that resort hotel that overlooked Lake Harriet, it was built as the Bellevue House, then taken over by the Lurline Club. About 1894, there were enough families moving into the neighborhood that the Lake Harriet School was revived. It had started in the late 1880s, but they could never get more than about a dozen students together. 1894, there was a clamoring for a school, and they rented the upper level rooms from what was originally the hotel for the Lake Harriet School, and these are the school children proudly posing on the lake-facing side of what was between 1894 and 1898, also used as a Lake Harriet School. And the first Sunday school classrooms in the neighborhood were also held in this building. 1898, grand event right across the street from the church here on Sheridan at 42nd Street is this frame building. The neighborhood gets its own school. 1898, and within a few years, great growth had resulted in a brick school building that was built in 3 phases from 1906 to 1911. This is, you can still see the frame building off to the right edge, and to the left would have been my kindergarten classroom, not yet shown, built in 1911. Now, some of the historic buildings at I call it the Loop, but basically it was built around the Loop that Aaron showed. West 44th Street, the neighborhood was in need of some fire protection. So what's now been converted to a restaurant was built as the first motorized equipment firehouse in 1914. Before that, to the right, was the Lake Harriet Commercial Club building, built in 1911. Post office was there, early library. Now the Wild Rumpus Bookshop on the left side there.
Yeah, I didn't even know for a long time there was a post office in Linden Hills, and the postal pouches were delivered by streetcar from the main post office downtown. Okay, we have a series of aerial photos. These were all taken kind of in the 1925-1930 period by a gentleman named Quigley for the Minneapolis Public Schools. And Quigley had some connections in aviation, and so he simply went up with a camera, and they flew around and took all sorts of pictures of all the school sites. And so it is a wonderful record, aerial record of Minneapolis during that period. And so you're looking down on Linden Hills, and I don't know how well you can see it, but you can see the Lake Harriet School in the bottom center on Sheridan Avenue, which kind of angles down to the intersection of 43rd where it meets Upton. And if you look, you can see the streetcar is over by the lake. You can see it going under the Linden Hills Boulevard Bridge and the Dakota Apartment and the others that are still there today. And then you may be able to make it out, the Lake Harriet streetcar loop. And then from there, most of the buildings, the older buildings in Linden Hills, are apparent. So now we're we're west of Lake Harriet. No, I'm sorry. We're west of Lake Calhoun, excuse me. Right. That's Minnetonka Golf Course in the foreground. Yeah, you can see the links over there. And this is actually, it's France Avenue is the street that defines the area that's built up with the area that isn't. The area in the foreground that is not built up, that is St. Louis Park. Now here we get a little closer. You're looking down on the south side of Lake Calhoun and Cottage City. And now remember when I mentioned that channel that they thought that they would make down to Linden Hills Park, that's the bare area that you see. And that's because the ground was very low, the water table was very high. And I live in the middle of Cottage City, and my house is on a little ridge, but you can always tell in that neighborhood if it's a post-World War II home, it's probably sitting on pilings, and it's where the bad soil was. And this is 44th and France. And you're looking east along 44th Street. You see 44th Street crossing the streetcar tracks and the streetcar tracks paralleling it. You see Sunnyside Avenue cutting off at an angle to the right, and the streetcar loop at 44th and France. And then, of course, this was Morningside back then. And it hadn't filled in too much. You can see the area where the co-op is today and Sunnyside Gardens was pretty much undeveloped.
So after the pavilion era, which lasted from 1888 to 1925, there was a lull. And the park board didn't have the funds to design one of the grand music buildings that was proposed. So in the end, in 1927, they finally built what was described as a temporary band shell, the best that their money could build. Now, of course, those of you who remember the building, this was the band shell that I grew up with, and it was there until 1985.
What I remember, we moved to town in 58, and my dad was very taken with Lake Harriet. And back then, what you would do, you could sit in front of it, but the parking lot, you could park in the parking lot to watch the concert. It was like a drive-in theater that way.
Yeah. And the park board handed out little cards that say, do not honk, for your appreciation after each piece of music was finished. So at the same time as the bandshell was built, they built the refectory, similar design over to the right side there. And a very significant building is on the left. I'll let Aaron talk about that.
Yeah, what you're looking at on the left, if you've been down to our little streetcar, that may look familiar. Our streetcar is a replica. Our streetcar depot is a replica of that building, which was built in 1901 by the neighborhood as the first streetcar station at 42nd Street for Lake Harriet, and it was replaced in 1912 by that much larger Harry Wild Jones designed building. But this little thing survived. It went down to the West Shore where it was used as the canoe rental office, and then at some time here in the 1950s, which is when this picture was taken, it migrated up by the refectory and at some point was torn down.
So we have, boating has been a tradition at Lake Harriet since the 19th century, and here are some of the parkboard docks. Looking up the hill, up 42nd Street, there's the backside of the 1914 depot. And then, of course, each of the lakes had a launch, and this was the Harriet. I remember that. And on the other lakes, there would be you could take a 3-lake cruise because the Calhoun, Isles, and Cedar were all connected.
And originally, there were docks all along. This boat would make a circuit, and there were multiple stops. But in later years, when I rode this, and pretty much when this is, probably 1960s, it would simply make a big counterclockwise loop around the perimeter of the lake and bring you back.
So we're going to talk about a few buildings that were prominent, have been prominent in the neighborhood. I think all of these survive. This was built as the Lake Harriet Methodist Church in 1916, replacing an earlier church. And of course, you didn't simply tear down buildings, and no matter how modest. And the original Lake Harriet Methodist Church is now at about 49th. Well, I don't know. Anyways, it's over there on 49th, and it's like it's the Zen Center or the York. I see. Okay. So the predecessor still exists in the area.
Excuse me, but while that church was being built, they allowed the parishioners to have Sunday services in the Harriet Theater, which later became Clark Harbor or Byers Harbor.
Yes. Thank you, Russ.
That was 1912.
Okay. Very dear to the neighborhood, in 1929, the library comes up with funds to build this very substantial library, which has been remodeled now at least twice, around 2000 and just this past year. And it was designed by a neighborhood resident, architect Joseph Vanderbilt. Facing 46th Street. 47th?
Yeah, it's between 47th
and 46th and 47th. This is the 47th Street frontage, the original part of the Southwest High School. I can remember most of those classrooms. And there's a sign out front.
Yeah, this is, you notice it says Federal Works Agency, Public Works Administration. And this was part of the FDR New Deal construction. And by the way, later this year, I think it's in November, David, that I'm going to be giving a presentation on the New Deal buildings and improvements that are still around in Minnesota. It turns out that there's a lot of them. The public invested in them, and they've lasted a long, long time.
Another institution in Linden Hills, designed by Vanderbilt, St. Thomas Church, and all the associated buildings. This was the site of the largest private estate in the community. Linden Hills was at one time envisioned as a sort of a Lowry Hill type neighborhood because you had the amenity of Lake Harriet in particular, and there were only 2 or 3 large homes of that caliber that were ever built in Linden Hills. This was the Fletcher Estate, and then that became St. Thomas Church in the 1920s. And then what I call the new bandshell, here under construction, the winter of 1985-86, first season It's 1986, and it has been cleaned up and renovated, including for this upcoming season. This is one of my favorite photographs. This is looking north on Upton Avenue, crossing 43rd Street. So Upton veers off to the left, and going up the hill, that's Sheridan. So again, it's one thing to draw this all out on a plat and sell property. It's something else to convince families to come out here to live. And it took until about 1900 before you saw a lot of development. Now that was before 1898, because we do not yet see the Lake Harriet School on top of that hill. Very long-lasting business. There were many grocery stores in the neighborhood, both around 43rd and Upton, going up along the streetcar track on 44th Street, and scattered through the neighborhood. But the Hawkinson brothers had their business here on the west side of the 4300 block of Upton for many years, and I think that became the co-op. Later location of the co-op building, yeah. So there's their delivery wagon.
Okay, so here you're once again at 43rd and Upton. In this case, you're looking east. Those buildings ought to look pretty familiar, with the exception of the one on the right. Maybe it's been changed, but the streetscape is more or less as it was. There's two really wonderful photos that Joe Ellen found and sent to us, and this is 1960. And of course, you're looking across 43rd Street south at the business district. This next one is kind of cool because you can see all of the stores. So you have the Upton, but then you've got a realty, you've got a meat shop, you've got a bakery. Just kind of a classic neighborhood streetscape.
Is that Yogi Bear up there?
That is Yogi Bear. Somebody, might have been Ruth, asked me in a previous talk whether the bear at the pavilion in the 1880s was named Yogi or not, but here he is. This is looking at the east side of Upton, looking north towards 43rd Street. Yeah. So I remember the bakery. I've had a walking tour years ago, and I explained that when I was growing up, going to Lake Harriet School, we'd come down here and you could buy a cinnamon roll for 5 cents, and we were standing in front of Turtle Bread at the time. I explained that now it was $5. So
I worked at the bakery for a couple of years in high school.
And then it became the co-op, I think.
Bakery lines were so long, you take a number and go over to Hawkinson's at the hardware store and make your purchases and come back and they can call your number after.
So the streetcars quit in 1954, replaced by the number 6 bus. And in 1971, we rebuilt the mile of track, the Minnesota Streetcar Museum, and we've been running there ever since. So now it's like 53, 54 years or something that we've been in operation. And what year was this, Peter, that they did this?
oh man, late 1990s.
Yeah, 1990 sometime. If you remember, there was a big uproar when they went to build the ponds around the west side of then Lake Calhoun. The West Calhoun neighborhood was organized to fight this, claiming this would be a swamp and property values would be lowered, and this kind of shows maybe that isn't always correct. This area, every time it would rain, it would sort of semi-flood and there'd be ducks in it. But this, of course, was one of the big steps the park board made to clean up the lake, because it took the sewer line that straight piped from Xerxes Avenue right into the lake and diverted it into 3 holding ponds that settled the particulates and then spit the and then flowed into the lake, and by that point it was cleaner water.
So we published, the Linden Hills History Study Group published a local history book called Down at the Lake, A History of the Lake Harriet District in 2001. And to bring us up to date, there have been new information uncovered or things happening in the community since the book was initially published, one of which was with the ability to view historic newspapers online and search by word. I can tell you, having spent hundreds of hours on old microfilm readers and finding things by chance, This was remarkable. One of the things that we had not been aware of and has since been explored in an exhibit at the library and in several presentations in the community was that there was an episode in late 1909, early 1910, where a woman who lived, Mary Caulfield, lived in the 4400 block of Zenith. She was not especially happy with her neighbors, and she decided that it would serve them right if she sold her home to a black minister. What that really revealed is that although Linden Hills was platted before racial deed restrictions, that there were underlying community standards, and the realtors and the near neighbors united and raised money to buy the black minister out, and one or two other black families who lived in the neighborhood previously were discouraged from staying, and whatever combination of circumstances, there were very, very few black families living in the neighborhood for decades to follow. This is now jumping back a little bit in history because 43rd and Upton no longer looks like that. This was Weber's pond. Henry W. Weber owned a grocery store at the northwest corner of 43rd and Upton, and the Lake Harriet Commercial Club organized to get a sewer line. That might be the one that's being replaced this summer. I don't know if that's the exact one. But so it lasted 100 and some years. Anyways, there are the neighborhood boys, including one who used to come speak to our group. One of the Ebert brothers, I think, is one of the boys in that boat. And so that was drained, and it really has been the focus of that commercial district. And years later, there was a dispute about what should replace the gas station, then a rib restaurant on the corner. And eventually there was a smaller building built at 43rd and Upton that instead of being 5 stories, it was 4 stories and a little bit smaller in scale.
Yeah, the purpose of this picture is just to point out, as Peter has called it, there's been a third wave of development in Linden Hills. You've seen all the teardowns happen, both here and in Edina, and we've also seen under the Minneapolis 2040 plan, and there was an area plan done of Linden Hills as to how to increase development and density, especially on transit-oriented corridors. And so the building went up at 43rd and Upton, and now this one, which is right next to Turtle Bread on 44th Street between Abbott and Beard, is another example. And there are others, and there will probably be more of the densification and redevelopment of Linden Hills.
Having grown up, being fortunate in growing up just south of now Badema-Casca, and I saw some of these homes being built on my way walking to school for 12 or 13 years through the community. The pile driver hard at work, the crews building these 1960s infill homes. I thought that the community was fully developed. And it appears every time I drive through, I see a sign from a distance, and I'm thinking, okay, it's not simply for sale, but it's for sale as a buildable lot. And what has happened, at least in my lifetime and my experience, is when I went to elementary school at Lake Harriet, there were definitely working class families that I knew well. And this is a example of the transition. This was the Charlie and Maddie Mousseau cottage that I showed earlier, the upper left-hand corner, an aerial view of that block fronting onto the parkway and the beach. And this is on the lower right-hand corner, the home that replaced the cottage. And I have to make this comparison, although it's conditioned by a few things. So the Mousseaus built their home for $200. The home on the site now is approaching $2 million. So it's not, the dollar is not the same, and the condition and quality of the house is not the same either. But I think that eventually what has happened is that the inherent value of the setting, the lakes and the parks and everything else, has become a major factor in the desirability of the homes. And we've seen a lot of teardowns. I don't know how many of these multi-unit like 3 and 4 unit buildings will be built because the whole concept of the 2040 plan has been thrown into question. But certainly there's been an upgrading, which is not surprising given the inherent value of the neighborhood's location. So that's the end of our images, but we're certainly welcoming questions.
I wondered if the fish that you, Jones that you mentioned, is Fish Jones, the same Jones?
So the question was, would there be a relationship between Harry Wild Jones and Fish Jones? And the answer is not that I know of. Jones is one of those common names. Sometimes you come across names that are very unique, but no. Fish Jones, for those of you not familiar with the story, was somebody who decided to keep exotic animals and was pushed out of his area near what is now the Basilica of St. Mary's and established a sort of an amusement zoo garden, whatever, recreational, Longfellow Gardens, just east of Minnehaha Falls.
And he's the one who built the replica of the Longfellow House by Minnehaha Falls.
Hi, my name is Joe Beeson, I'm in South St. Paul. I talked with Joellen, and I believe her name is Gina. Is that right? I don't know, last week. I do research and I write about old golf courses, lost golf courses. I've written 2 books about them. And there is a Spalding golf record book, and it's actually a guide with entrance for Lake Harriet Golf Club in both 1900 and 1901. And I'm wondering if anybody has heard of such a thing. Just last week, I also came across a clip from 1899, I believe it was the Minneapolis Tribune. I have it with me. That said the YMCA was contemplating building a golf course on, I think it probably was Linden Hills land. But just wondering if anybody has heard anything about that. Very interested in writing about it because I've been researching lost golf courses for almost 15 years now, and have not heard anything about that place.
Well, to start the answer, speaking for Aaron and myself, we're not familiar with anything other than the Minnetonka Club, and I recall that some of the founders of that club had moved over from the Bryn Mawr Golf Club, and it was a tremendous opportunity there on the west side of then Lake Calhoun, which had not been successfully developed over the years. So it was a found opportunity for them to build that one. But I do want to mention that David had introduced the program and said that we've been doing programs as the Linden Hills History Study Group for some 25 years. And we do not know everything, and we welcome anybody who has some new information, would like to do a program, certainly would like to invite you to do so. Maybe somebody else in the audience can shed some light on the lost golf courses of Linden Hills.
I could print this out if you're interested.
Yeah, very much so. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, it says YMCA. This is June 1899. Minneapolis Journal. It says the YMCA is contemplating laying out a course at or near Linwood, something black ink has been decided. Nothing has been decided on that. It would be, for my limited purpose as a golf historian, it would be a rather amazing discovery if I could find out about it.
I will mention, Aaron had the mic when we showed that aerial photograph looking from the west, from St. Louis Park overlooking towards Minnetonka and Lake Calhoun. But the tour that I'm giving in July, coming up for 2 consecutive evenings, same tour, is this corner of Linden Hills, the northwest corner bordering Minnetonka Golf Club and France Avenue at St. Louis Park. So we'll be talking a little bit about Minnetonka at that program, but really sort of as an edge and what happens along the boundary as it comes right up to Linden Hills.
I know that Minnetonka, there's a rich history there and connections to the beginning of Toro and also connections to the Royland Club, I believe. The membership for that. So, any other questions? Okay.
Hi, thank you. My name's Andrew. I'm a fairly new resident in the neighborhood, 5 years now. You showed some very interesting early plats. Can you speak at all to the dynamics of why those plats were incorporated in the city of Minneapolis? Because we're pushing the border of other municipalities here. Just a point of curiosity.
So the city was eager to grow. Started out in the 1870s fairly slowly, incrementally, but then, especially with the establishment of the park board, became very aggressive in expanding. And so there was resistance to that. On the west side, you had a number of villages incorporating, including Edina. And so there was established a very hard limit westward of the city's expansion. And I think same thing as it was approaching Richfield, they put their foot down. And so there was a sort of a reaction to that expansion. But
they took part of Richfield, though.
Yeah. No, that's yeah. Yeah. So.
Richfield and Edina were established prior to.
Yeah, this was all. It's Hennepin County and Minneapolis Township and Richfield Township, and that's a whole sequence of shifting from the core, because Richfield Township originally went up as far north as Lake Street, and it was cut back to 46th Street, and then Richfield, I think the township of Richfield was 6 miles by 6 miles more or less over to the Mississippi, and the surviving city of Richfield is just a very small fragment of the original township.
We just recently had a program on Morningside, which had a really interesting relationship in and out of Edina, and so that's something we just did recently.
Thank you.
This perfectly segues into my comment I'm going to make about Morningside. If you've seen the Alfred Hitchcock movie The Birds, lead actress Tippi Hedren and her family lived just across the border in Morningside when she was a child. She was originally from New Ulm. Her family moved to the Morningside neighborhood when she was about a toddler. And I think they lived in a house just west of Franks Avenue.
Well, thanks so much for this. My name is Jennifer Alexander, and I've met Aaron before. I'm super intrigued by the steam-powered trolley. Was that how extensive was that? Was that sort of unique here, or I've not heard of that before?
Well, back before electricity became practical in 1888, they were looking for any method to go and power streetcars, because the only alternative at the time was horses, which was slow and produced manure and got sick and all. 1873, the bridge technology, the cable car, was created in San Francisco, where you had a stationary engine powering a cable under the street that the streetcar would just grab a hold of, and that wound up getting built in 25 cities, including St. Paul. But the only other real power source they had, kind of off the shelf, was steam locomotives. The only problem was, in an urban setting, steam locomotives were rolling pollution sources, and not only would they go and create a lot of soot, but ashes and sparks came out and would burn holes in your clothes, and so they were extremely unpopular. And from the day that little line started running, there was opposition, to the point where one of the Washburns, who had a mansion on Marquette Avenue in what is now the middle of downtown, managed to talk the city council of Minneapolis into banning the steam locomotive north of 6th Street. And when it got to 6th Street, they had to go and uncouple the steam locomotive and put horses on to take it the rest of the way up to Bridge Square. And so even though it was a reliable power source, everyone hated it in the city.
Okay. On a history note, not related to what you're talking about, my name's Bob Klein. I went to Audubon, which is on 42nd and Chowan, and this Saturday they are celebrating their 100th birthday. And they're having an event at the school, which is now known as Lake Harriet Lower, from 1 to 4 on Saturday. Just like it might be interesting.
My name is Sally Gillette. I live on the south end of Lake Harriet and love it. Love this place and also Linden Hills. And I'm wondering about the natives who were here. You mentioned them, but didn't say why did they leave? And do we have any artifacts? Are there besides the modern commemoration, I'm just kind of curious about that. Thank you.
Well, it was the Dakota that were in Cloudman's Village, and what it says in the Linden Hills history book, I don't have special knowledge of my own, but I'm going by what was in there, was that the Indian agent went and suggested that village be put there, and the Dakota were a little bit reluctant because that was sort of on the frontier of where they were having the long fighting wars with the Ojibwe. And in fact, there wound up being a battle nearby, and they moved, south to the Minnesota River Valley as a result of that. So the Ojibwe were coming in sort of from Michigan and northern Wisconsin and driving the Dakota west. That was sort of happening at the same time.
About 20 years ago, I was doing a walking tour of at the west side of then Lake Calhoun, and somebody asked the question of, well, we're looking at this community, but who lived here before? And it's not that I had never thought about it, but in the subsequent years, I've had the opportunity to be part of a process of meeting with descendants of the Dakota people who lived in the village and have been instrumental in the name restoration of the lake and the narrative. If you go down to, you don't have to be at the public art, but there is a companion piece which is online, which is hearing what I did at the session where the project was envisioned, and that is you can hear the spoken Dakota language. It's a living language. It's a living people. I made the mistake of thinking that they had only been here for a few hundred years because there's a marker in the area of that artwork that talks about the presence going back 200 years or so. The frame of reference there was the earliest European travelers, whether it was Father Hennepin, whoever. They documented the presence of the Dakota. The Dakota were here many, many years earlier, and Aaron has basically framed their departure in relation to the 1839. There was a dispute, let's call it, between the Dakota and the Ojibwe, and it was no longer safe after that battle for the Dakota to remain relatively distant from the other Dakota villages along the Minnesota River and the Fort Snelling. So unfortunately, and then within years, by the early 1860s, the Dakota were essentially removed from the state entirely. It was not so much what's happening at Lake Calhoun or Lake Harriet, it was what's happening with westward expansion in the entire state. And if you go to the Minnesota History Center, I think they've done a very good job in making an effort to tell those stories. It's worth going over there.
And on the east side of Beday-McCoska, there are excellent exhibits and information about the Dakota, and Peter helped with that. So I recommend that you go over there and look. I also want to remind you, this is Linden Hills History 101. If you want more details, get the book. We wrote this book 20-some years ago, and we're working on updating it, but it's down at the lake, and I'm not sure where you can get it around. I think you can, pretty sure you can get it at Sedgman's Hardware and some other, you can get it actually from Amazon, I think. So, more questions?
Well, let's see. I don't see any more hands. I think we've probably kept you here long enough. The room's getting a little hot. Thank you very much.